Christianity is about love and inclusivity. But the main thing that I get from this gospel story here is a call overall for a great humility before this mystery that is God. Hi everyone, Angelo here. I'm a creative and theologian, and it's the 26th Sunday in Ordinary Time. So we're in chapter 9 of Mark here, and we have John coming to Jesus saying, we see somebody working in your name, and we tried to stop them, but we couldn't stop them. And Jesus says, nah, you don't need to stop them, because if they work in my name, chances are they wouldn't have nothing bad to say about me. And he says to John too, if anyone gives you a cup of water to drink just because you belong to Christ, and I tell you solemnly, that person definitely will not lose their reward. And then we move into the second half of the gospel here. And so Jesus continues speaking for the rest of the gospel. And he says a bunch of different things. Things like, if anyone is an obstacle to bring down one of the little ones, whoever the little ones are, then it's better that they get thrown into the sea with a big stone around their neck. Or if your hand causes you to sin, it's best you cut it off. Or if your eye causes you to sin, it's best you pluck it out. And what he's getting at ultimately is saying that it's better you enter, his words here says it's better you enter into life. And so he's saying it's better you enter into life less than whole, rather than not entering into life at all. So in our minds, we might have an idea of how things ought to be versus how things actually currently are, right? And I mean, I do too. I feel like I have a whole vision of how I think things ought to be versus how they currently are. But the thing is, I only have one piece of the puzzle, the same way everybody listening, we all only have one piece of the puzzle. So it seems like in the minds of the disciples too, they thought that they didn't have just one piece of the puzzle. They thought that they had the whole puzzle. It seemed like they thought that they were the only way, that they were it, that their unit was the only way that things should be. But the reality is, though, if we take a look at Jesus' life in the Gospels, we will realize that he had followers from all over the place, so many followers with so many different backgrounds. And it seems like the only thing that could have held all of those people together was Christ himself. And I suppose it's very similar to the way our church is made up too, where there's so many of us that comes from so many different backgrounds. And we all have different ideas on how we think church ought to be. And I mean, again, I will emphasize here that I do as well. I'm not immune to this at all. But it seems like the only thing that could hold all of us together, the only thing that could hold billions of people together, really and truly, is Christ. So like I said last week, it seems like we have this obsession with power and control. And when things aren't the way we would like for them to be, when things aren't the way we think they ought to be, our immediate response is to control harder. Or at least anything near the male response is to want to control harder. Because I do find that people who are able to tap into their divine feminine energy are able to let go and trust in God. Also, it seems a little bit easier than most. So I always do wonder how Jesus's female disciples reacted to his teachings. So even what he would have said in this gospel story, for example. And if you're curious as to how you could enter into a relationship with your divine feminine, I would encourage you to have a conversation with one of my dear friends, Dr. Dana James, because I think she's a solid person that could help guide anyone and really direct them to set them on a path to really encounter that side of life. But the main thing that I get from this gospel story here is a call overall for a great humility before this mystery that is God. Meaning that we don't know everything about God. even if sometimes that we think we do. And ultimately, what we can do is humble ourselves and really take a look and just gaze at this mystery that is God. And of course, for us as Christians, we understand this mystery as Trinity. And if there's anybody who I think could really help anybody come into encounter with the depth and the vastness and the just grandeur of God, I do think Father Martin Sergiu, is a solid person to have a conversation with too. Because, again, sometimes we might think we know everything about God, whereas we only know a tiny, tiny little bit based on this little perspective that we do have. But there are some people who are able to bring us into this fear of the Lord, meaning not this running away from God, but rather this awe and wonder and just a great reverence for this divine mystery. But it really is a helplessness overall. So like here, for example, we have John, who I'm sure is very well intentioned. And he's reporting to Jesus because in John's mind, something seems to be off. But for Jesus, nothing is off, right? And instead, Christ says, anyone who is not against us is for us. The disciples here, and not just in this story, because all throughout the Gospels, especially in Mark, the disciples display this either or type of thinking. And Jesus is here saying to be both and. So is this level like a low level thinking from the disciples? And I will link this video where Richard Rohr explains like the stages of faith and development really well. But it's a low level type of thinking that the disciples display. Is a power struggle overall. But Christianity isn't about that. Christianity is about love and inclusivity, not about exclusion and control. So it reminds me of this metaphor, or this concept rather, that Karl Rahner would have had, where it's called the anonymous Christian. And I'll try to simplify this, because if there's anybody who is familiar with Karl Rahner, or at least having studied him, is painfully aware that there's, at least it's my opinion, but there's nothing simple about what this man had to say. So even if I won't do it justice, but I'll try my best to explain. So Rahner had this concept called the anonymous Christian, where he says, okay, God is good and God made everything good, and all of creation is good, and God's goodness is moving in and out all throughout all of creation. And that if a person, even if they're not Christian, responds to God's goodness in their life with the goodness of God that is inside of them, because of course we believe that God and God's graciousness is inside all of us. So that if a person responds to God's grace with grace from inside of them, then even if that person isn't a Christian, but they still embody Christian values, then that's what he would call an anonymous Christian. Or the way I would like to put it forward, in my own theological understanding of things, is this is how people hug God back in this relationship of the divine hug. Meaning that the way I see baptism, the metaphor I use for baptism, is that God hugs us, that we enter into a divine hug with God. And of course, as humans with free will, we could choose to hug God back or not. But the thing is, just because a person hasn't been baptized into the Christian faith, it doesn't mean that God isn't hugging them, and it doesn't mean that they don't know God in a very real sense. So they might not necessarily have or be interested in a doctrinal understanding of God the way Christians understand God. But it doesn't mean that they don't follow and embody the Holy Spirit. I think it would be super unreasonable to think that. So the thing is, as Catholic Christians, we hold at least one key to union with God. And for us, that at least one key, if not more, is through the sacraments. See, so the sacraments are our unique gift from God, but it doesn't mean that they are God's only gift to humanity. It doesn't mean that the sacraments are the only key to being in union with God. So, another way of saying it is just because I might wear a large t-shirt, for example, it doesn't mean that everybody has to wear a large t-shirt. Some people wear extra large, some people wear medium. And I mean, ultimately, if we tried to put the entire world in double XL shirts, it wouldn't fit. So, I think our experience of God, or at least my experience of God, is that God reveals God's self as generous more than transactional. And I think the parable of the workers in the vineyard is a good example of that. So when we are able to humble ourselves and take a step back from the either or thinking and take a step closer to the both and thinking, we, as Jesus, what we understand what Jesus says in the Gospels in a different light, and things make a lot more sense. So like in the second half of the Gospel, for example, what Christ says here sounds harsh. And I would hope we don't go taking Mark literally here and engage in any sort of self-mutilation because we believe our body makes us sin, especially because that goes against the entire notion where we believe that God created us as good. What we can do, though, is we can humble ourselves. And when we humble ourselves, we cut off the negativity and corruption that we choose to participate in. And it doesn't always have to be anything big and nefarious. I mean, sometimes it could be things as simple as gossiping about others or watching people with judgment in our hearts. Because the reality is we are all guilty of this. It's a conditioned behavior, especially here in Trinidad and Tobago. But we don't have to be that way. Because as human beings, we have the propensity for so much more. We could use our gifts of observance and intuition and creativity for God's mission on earth. And we could dedicate our whole bodies, our whole selves, to service of the poor and the vulnerable. We could dedicate our whole selves to justice. We could dedicate our whole selves to integrity. We can integrate our whole selves, meaning our good and our bad, everything that is about us, into being the people that God knows so deeply and loves so dearly. And what that might look like in a practical sense is something as simple as giving a cup of water to someone because they belong to Christ. And if we keep Catholic social teaching in mind, those who belong to Christ first is always the poor, the vulnerable, the marginalized. So when we mediate God's grace to all of creation, that in and of itself is a priceless gift. Anyways, that's it from me this week. And as always, I appreciate you so much for watching. Thank you.